September 26th, 1918. 4:47 in the morning. The Meuse Argonne, France. Rain hammered the observation post, turning everything beyond 20 yards into gray soup. Corporal Frank Mosher, 23 years old, pressed his eyes against the artillery scope, rain streaming down the metal housing. His hands, numb from 4 hours in the wet, gripped a stopwatch and a grease pencil. Behind him, somewhere in the darkness and mud, 155mm howitzers of the 42nd Division Artillery waited for coordinates he hadn't yet calculated. 3 miles northeast, across a landscape of churned earth and shattered forest, German counter-battery positions were preparing their own barrage. Intelligence said 40 guns, maybe more. Heavy artillery, the kind that could evaporate an American battery in 6 minutes of accurate fire. Dawn was 90 minutes away. The American infantry was scheduled to go over at 5:30 a.m. sharp. If those German guns opened up during the attack, hundreds of doughboys would die before they reached the wire. Every artillery officer in the sector had tried to silence those positions. Standard counter-battery procedure. Calculate enemy gun positions from muzzle flashes. Deliver suppressing fire. Hope you got close enough. 3 days of bombardment. Thousands of shells expended. The German guns kept firing. Mosher was about to do something that would make any trained artilleryman call him insane. He wasn't going to aim at where the German guns were. He was going to aim at where they would be. And he was going to time the shells to arrive not when the Germans were firing, but during the 15-second window when they were most vulnerable. No officer had authorized this. Battalion command had explicitly told him to stick to standard flash spotting procedure. The French artillery liaison had actually laughed when Mosher tried to explain his idea. "C'est stupid," the man had said. Stupid. And somehow, for the next 43 minutes, Mosher was going to prove that stupid wins wars. Frank Mosher was not born to be a soldier. He came from Osceola, Iowa, population 3,200, in Clark County, where the prairie rolled gentle and endless. Born in 1895, the fourth son of a railroad section foreman who spent his days measuring clearances and calculating load distributions. His father, Thomas Mosher, worked for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, maintaining track in a job that required mathematical precision most men didn't possess. One miscalculation, a rail gauge off by a quarter inch, a ballast bed settled wrong, and a derailment could kill dozens. Thomas taught his boys that timing was everything. A freight train doing 40 miles per hour, he told young Frank one afternoon at the kitchen table, papers spread between them, covers 58 feet per second. If you're measuring track clearance and you're off by 2 seconds in your calculation, that's 116 feet of error. That's the difference between safe and dead. Frank absorbed this. While his brothers played baseball, he sat with his father's railroad manuals, learning to calculate velocity, trajectory, and impact forces. By age 12, he could predict exactly when a train would arrive, based on its departure time, track grade, and load weight. His brothers called him Clock, because he was always checking his father's pocket watch, timing things nobody else thought to time. He worked as a railroad telegraph operator after high school, a job that required split-second precision. Messages came through in Morse code bursts. Frank learned to recognize patterns in the rhythm of the key, to anticipate what was coming next based on what had come before. He began timing the intervals between freight trains, between passenger expresses, between signal changes. His logbook filled with numbers. 7 minutes 34 seconds between eastbound and westbound at Junction 12. Freight train 1847 consistently runs 2 minutes 18 seconds behind schedule at mile 47. The station master asked him once why he bothered. "Because patterns matter," Frank said. "If you know the pattern, you know what comes next." His father died in 1916, crushed between 2 freight cars during a coupling operation. Frank was 21. At the funeral, he stood at the grave thinking about timing. 2 seconds. If his father had moved 2 seconds faster, he'd still be alive. When America entered the war in April 1917, Frank walked into the recruiting station in Des Moines. The recruiter looked at his railroad experience and his mathematics scores. "Field artillery," the man said. "They need men who can calculate firing solutions." Frank trained at Camp Funston, Kansas. where the Army crammed artillery science into 12 weeks that should have taken 12 months. He learned about ballistic trajectories, propellant charges, wind drift, and map coordinates. But what interested him most was what they called time on target, calculating exactly when a shell would land based on distance, elevation, and propellant load. Most men in his battery struggled with the math. Frank found it natural. A shell from a 155mm howitzer at maximum charge traveled at 1,600 feet per second, but that velocity decreased with air resistance, affected by temperature, barometric pressure, and humidity. The calculations filled pages. Frank did them in his head. What the instructors didn't teach, what nobody seemed to think about, was that the enemy had timing patterns too. German artillery batteries followed doctrine. They fired, then immediately moved to alternate positions to avoid counter-battery fire. Standard procedure. Everyone knew it, but nobody thought to measure it. During a training exercise, Frank timed how long it took American batteries to displace after firing. 14 minutes on average. He timed how long it took them to set up in the new position. 8 minutes. He timed the interval between the last round fired from the old position and the first round fired from the new position. 23 minutes. Almost exactly. Every single time. When he mentioned this to Lieutenant Harrison, the battery commander, the officer shrugged. Doctrine's doctrine. Corporal. That's how it's done. But, sir, Frank said, if we know their timing, we could. We aim at where the enemy is, Corporal, not where they might be. Stick to your firing tables. The other men in the battery started calling him Prophet Mosher, because he was always trying to predict what the enemy would do based on timing patterns. Some meant it as a compliment. Most meant it as mockery. Frank kept his stopwatch and his notebooks and his observations to himself after that. By September 1918, the American Expeditionary Force was bleeding itself against the German defensive lines in the Meuse-Argonne. It was the largest American operation of the war. 1.2 million American troops attempting to break through fortified German positions that had been prepared for 4 years. The Germans held the high ground, commanding fields of fire across valleys the Americans had to cross. And they had artillery. Lots of artillery. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had begun on September 26th. And it was brutal. American casualties in the first week would exceed 45,000 men. The landscape was a nightmare of mud, wire, and shell craters. Villages were erased from the map. Roads became rivers of churned earth. And above it all, German artillery pounded American positions with methodical precision. The problem was German counter-battery fire. Every time American guns opened up to support an attack, German artillery observers would spot the muzzle flashes, calculate positions, and deliver devastating return fire. American batteries were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Standard American counter-battery doctrine wasn't working. The Germans would fire, then immediately displace to alternate positions before American counterfire arrived. By the time American shells landed, the German guns were gone. This was the impossible equation. How do you destroy an enemy who moves before you can hit them? Frank Mosher's battery, part of the 42nd Rainbow Division Artillery, had been in position near Montfaucon for 3 days. They'd fired hundreds of rounds in support of infantry attacks. They'd endured German counter-battery fire that killed 6 men and destroyed 2 howitzers. And they'd failed, like everyone else, to silence the German guns. The observation post where Frank now huddled was a sandbagged hole on a slight rise, offering a view across the valley to the German positions. It wasn't much, just enough elevation to see the muzzle flashes when German guns fired. He'd been detailed to flash spotting duty, observe enemy fire, calculate coordinates, radio them back for counter-battery missions. He'd been watching those German guns for 72 hours straight, timing everything. September 26th, 4:47 a.m. The rain hammered down. Frank's logbook lay open in front of him, pages protected by a canvas gas cape filled with numbers. German battery position. A1 fires at 03:47 hours. Displaces. Next fire at 04:11 hours equals 24-minute interval. Fires at 04:11 hours. Displaces. Next fire at 04:35 hours equals 24-minute interval. Fires at 04:35 hours. Displaces. Next fire at 0458 hours equals 23-minute interval. He had 3 days of data, 47 separate firing sequences. The pattern was clear. German batteries fired approximately 8 rounds, then displaced to alternate positions. The displacement took between 22 and 25 minutes, with an average of 23 minutes and 40 seconds. Then they fired again. But Frank had noticed something else. During displacement, there was a window, approximately 15 seconds, when the German crews were most vulnerable. It was the moment when they'd arrived at the new position but hadn't yet unloaded and deployed the guns. The equipment was off the trucks, sitting in the open. The crews were clustered around, beginning the setup process. No camouflage nets up yet. No dispersal. Standard counter-battery doctrine said, wait for muzzle flash, calculate position, fire on that position. But the Germans would be gone by the time the shells arrived. Frank's idea was different. Don't wait for the flash. Predict when they'll fire next based on the timing pattern. Calculate where their alternate position is based on German doctrine, and deliver shells to arrive during that 15-second vulnerability window. He tried to explain this to Lieutenant Harrison 2 days ago. The lieutenant had listened, frowning. Corporal, you're asking me to fire at coordinates where the enemy isn't currently located, hoping they'll move there. Based on their pattern, sir, they will be there. Exactly 23 minutes and 40 seconds after their last fire mission. And if you're wrong, we waste ammunition and give away our position for nothing. Sir, if we keep doing what we've been doing, stick to flash spotting, Corporal. Report coordinates when you see muzzle flashes. That's your job. But tonight, this morning, was different. 0 hour for the big push was 5:30 a.m. In 43 minutes, American infantry would climb out of their trenches and advance across open ground. If those German guns were active, the attack would be slaughtered. Every officer in the sector knew it. Frank checked his stopwatch. The last German fire mission had been at 4:36 a.m., which meant, if the pattern held, they'd fire again at approximately 4:59 a.m., which meant they'd be in their displacement phase, vulnerable, at approximately 4:52 a.m., 7 minutes from now. He picked up the field telephone, hand-cranked the generator. Battery command answered. Command post. This is OP3, Corporal Mosher. I have predicted coordinates for counter-battery fire. Request immediate fire mission. A pause. Then Lieutenant Harrison's voice. Mosher? We're not firing on predictions tonight. Flash spot only. Sir. 0 hour is in 40 minutes. Those German batteries will massacre the infantry. Standard doctrine isn't working. This will work. This is your timing theory again. Yes, sir. I told you no, Corporal. Frank looked at his stopwatch. 6 minutes until the window. He thought about his father, crushed between 2 freight cars. 2 seconds. Timing was everything. Sir, he said, voice steady, I'm going to give you coordinates. You can choose whether to fire, but I'm telling you, if we hit them now, during displacement, we can destroy those batteries. All of them. Right now. The line went silent. Frank heard background noise. Officers arguing. Someone shouting about ammunition expenditure. Rain drumming on canvas. Then Harrison's voice. Give me the coordinates. Frank read from his notebook. Alternate position, Alpha 7. Grid reference, 628.4 by 318.9. Range, 9,400 yards. Target, German artillery in displacement phase. Time on target, 4:52 a.m. 5 minutes from now, sir. Another pause. Mosher, do you understand what you're asking? We're going to fire a full battery time on target barrage at coordinates where we haven't seen any enemy activity, hoping they'll move there in exactly 5 minutes? 4 minutes now, sir. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong, sir. The longest pause yet. Then, fire mission accepted. All batteries, stand by for predicted fire. Target coordinates, as reported by OP3. Frank heard it through the telephone and the rain, the clank and grind of howitzer breaches opening, the shouts of gun crews, the organized chaos of an artillery battery preparing for fire. He gripped his stopwatch, eyes on the second hand. The mathematics were complex, but Frank had done them 100 times. A 155mm howitzer firing at maximum charge could throw a 95-pound high-explosive shell 9,400 yards. Flight time at that range, approximately 32 seconds. But you had to account for wind drift, air density, temperature, barrel wear, propellant temperature. The actual flight time, given current conditions, would be closer to 33.7 seconds, which meant to have shells arrive at the target at exactly 4:52 a.m., the guns needed to fire at 4:51:26.3. Frank relayed the timing. Time on target fire. Execute firing at 4:51:26. Through the darkness behind him, he heard the battery commander shouting, "Load! High explosive! Charge 7! Elevation 950! Deflection 0285! The gun crews worked with practiced speed despite the mud and rain. Shells weighing nearly 100 pounds each, manhandled from ammunition trucks to gun positions, rammed into breaches. Powder charges verified. Breech blocks slammed shut. Lanyards attached. Frank watched his stopwatch. 4:51:0 26 seconds. The German guns were firing now. He could see the muzzle flashes 3 miles away, distant orange blooms in the rain. Which meant they were at the end of their fire mission. Which meant in approximately 90 seconds they'd begin displacement. Which meant 4:51:20. 6 seconds. Stand by, the battery commander's voice echoed through the rain. 4:51:25. Fire! The night erupted. 6 155mm howitzers fired simultaneously, a rolling thunder that shook mud from the observation post sandbags. Muzzle flashes turned the darkness orange-white, each blast a physical thing that compressed Frank's chest and rang in his ears despite the cotton wadding he'd stuffed in them. He started a second stopwatch. Flight time. 33.7 seconds. The shells were arcing through the darkness, barely visible against the black sky, climbing to their apex, then falling toward coordinates where, if Frank was right, German artillery crews were beginning to unload guns from their transport vehicles. 20 seconds. Frank pressed his eyes to the observation scope, focused on the area he'd predicted. Nothing visible through the rain, just darkness and distance. 30 seconds. The shells hit. Even 3 miles away, through rain and darkness, the explosions were unmistakable, not the small orange blooms of muzzle flashes. These were massive yellow-white detonations that lit the entire valley for a heartbeat. 1, 2, 4, 6 shells impacting in a cluster, high explosive rounds designed to destroy equipment and kill crews. And Frank had put them right into the center of a German artillery battery during the 15-second window when they were completely exposed. He heard the secondary explosions immediately. German ammunition cooking off. Shells stored on trucks, waiting to be unloaded, detonating in chain reactions. White-yellow flashes, then red flames climbing into the rain. "We hit them," Frank breathed. Direct hit, but he didn't have time to celebrate. His stopwatch said 4:53 a.m. The other German batteries would still be on their schedule. Battery position A2 would be displacing in approximately 4 minutes. A3 in 7 minutes. A4 in 9 minutes. He grabbed the field telephone. Command post, OP3. Target confirmed destroyed. I have additional predicted coordinates. Battery A2. Displacement in 4 minutes. Request immediate follow-up fire. This time, Harrison didn't hesitate. Send coordinates. Frank read from his notebook. He'd calculated 13 separate German artillery positions, each with predicted displacement schedules. 13 windows of vulnerability. 13 opportunities. Battery A2. Grid reference 630.1 by 321.4. Range 9,650 yards. Time on target, 4:57 a.m. The howitzers fired again. 33 seconds later, another cluster of explosions, another set of secondary detonations, another German battery destroyed during its most vulnerable moment. Battery A3. Grid reference 625.8 by 319.2. Range 9,280 yards. Time on target, 5:00 a.m. The pattern was working. Each German battery, following their doctrine, was moving to alternate positions at predictable intervals. And at each alternate position, Frank's timed barrages were arriving during the 15-second window when guns were off trucks, crews were clustered, and camouflage wasn't yet in place. The German artillery officers must have been frantically trying to understand what was happening. Their communications would be in chaos. How were the Americans hitting alternate positions that hadn't been fired from? How were the shells arriving during displacement when they were supposed to be invisible? Battery A4. Grid reference 632.7 by 323.8. Range 9,890 yards. Time on target 5:02 to 2 a.m. More thunder behind Frank. More orange muzzle flashes turning night into flickering day. More shells arcing through the rain. More explosions on the horizon. He'd been watching those German positions for 3 days, timing their every movement, building a mathematical model of their behavior. Now that model was being translated into high-explosive shells landing exactly when and where they'd do maximum damage. The German batteries tried to adapt. Frank saw it through his scope. One battery began its displacement 2 minutes early, breaking pattern. But breaking pattern meant revealing their new position before they were ready to fire from it. Frank called in coordinates on the half-ready position. American shells arrived 30 seconds after the Germans did, destroyed. Another battery tried waiting, holding fire to disrupt the timing. But holding fire meant they couldn't support their own infantry. And when they finally did fire, 27 minutes after their last mission instead of 23, Frank adjusted his calculations and caught them at their alternate position anyway. Battery A7, grid reference 629.9 by 320.1, range 9,420 yards, time on target 5:14 a.m. The eastern sky was beginning to gray with approaching dawn. 0 hour was 16 minutes away. Frank's notebook showed 13 German battery positions. He'd called fire missions on 11 of them. 2 remained. His hands ached from gripping the stopwatch and pencil. His eyes burned from staring through the observation scope. Rain had soaked through his uniform despite the canvas gas cape. His shoulders were bruised from the constant concussion of American howitzers firing behind him. But the German guns were falling silent. One by one, their muzzle flashes stopped. The counter-battery fire that had been pounding American positions for days simply stopped. Battery Anine. Grid reference 627.3 by 316.8. Range 9,150 yards. Time on target 5:22 a.m. The howitzers fired. 33 seconds of silence broken only by rain. Then the explosions. 3 miles away, another German position erased. One battery left. Position A13, the farthest north. Frank checked his calculations. They'd displaced at 4:58 a.m., which meant their next fire mission would be approximately 5:21 a.m., which meant they'd be vulnerable during displacement starting at 5:44 a.m., 14 minutes after 0 hour. But Frank had a better idea. Command post, OP3. Final target, battery A13. I'm predicting they'll attempt early displacement to avoid the pattern we've been hitting. Request fire mission to arrive at their current position in 3 minutes. Calculated to impact during their pre-displacement preparation phase. It was a gamble, but Frank had noticed that German crews, before displacing, always performed a specific sequence. Police the gun position, check camouflage, verify the alternate position was clear, then begin movement. That sequence took approximately 4 minutes. If he timed the shells to arrive during minute 3 of that sequence, the crews would be concentrated around the guns, preparing to move but not yet mobile. Coordinates? Harrison asked. Current position. Grid reference 633.4 by 325.1. Range 10,100 yards. Time on target 5:27 a.m. That's 3 minutes before 0 hour, Mosher. Yes, sir. It's also exactly when they'll be pulling camouflage nets, exposing the guns. Maximum vulnerability. You're sure? Frank thought about his father's voice. Timing is everything. The difference between safe and dead. I'm sure, sir. The final barrage. 6 howitzers, firing in unison, their thunder rolling across the dawn-gray landscape. Frank tracked the shell's flight in his mind. Climbing through rain, apex at 1,500 feet, falling, accelerating, impacting at 1,400 feet per second. The explosions walked across the distant German position like giant footsteps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 shells, all within a 50-yard radius, all arriving within 2 seconds of each other, all landing on a German artillery battery that was in the middle of removing camouflage nets. The secondary explosions were the largest yet. An entire battery's worth of ammunition storage, fuel for trucks, and pre-positioned charges, all cooking off simultaneously. The fireball was visible even 3 miles away in the pre-dawn rain. It burned for 20 seconds, a miniature sun on the horizon, then collapsed into rolling black smoke. Silence. Frank checked his watch. 5:28 a.m. 2 minutes until 0 hour. He raised his binoculars and scanned the German artillery positions. No muzzle flashes, no movement, no fire. Somewhere behind him, a whistle blew. Then another. Then hundreds. The American infantry was going over. But this time, they advanced across open ground without German artillery tearing them apart. This time, the only shells falling were American shells, walking ahead of the advancing doughboys in a creeping barrage. Frank Mosher sat in his sandbagged observation post, rain dripping from his helmet, hands shaking now that it was over, and watched the attack unfold. An attack that should have been a slaughter. An attack that succeeded because 40 German guns had been destroyed before they could fire a single round during the American advance. He clicked his stopwatch. 5:30 0 0 hour. Exactly on time. 4 hours later, Lieutenant Colonel Summerall, commanding the 42nd Division Artillery, arrived at the observation post. Frank was still there, exhausted, documenting the aftermath through his binoculars. American forward observers had reached the German artillery positions. Their reports were coming in by field telephone. Summerall climbed into the observation post, looked at Frank with an expression somewhere between disbelief and anger. "Corporal Mosher?" Frank stood, tried to salute, nearly fell over from exhaustion. "Sir, I've just read reports from our forward elements. They're finding destroyed German artillery positions at coordinates that match your predicted fire missions. 40 guns destroyed. 40. In 43 minutes. He paused. "Explain to me how the hell you did that." Frank handed him the logbook. Pages of numbers, timing sequences, displacement calculations. "They had a pattern, sir. I timed it. 23 minutes and 40 seconds, on average, between fire missions. During displacement, there's a 15-second window when they're vulnerable. I calculated when that window would occur for each battery, predicted their alternate positions based on German doctrine, and delivered time on target fire for each window." Summerall flipped through the pages. "You timed their displacement cycles?" "For 72 hours, sir. Every fire mission, every displacement, every interval. They were following doctrine. Doctrine is predictable." "And you just calculated when they'd be vulnerable?" "Yes, sir. Like a railroad schedule. If you know when the trains run, you know when they'll be at specific locations." Summerall stared at him, then at the logbook, then back at him. "Corporal, do you understand what you've done? Counter-battery fire doctrine since this war began has been reactive. Wait for enemy fire, calculate their position, return fire. You did the opposite. You predicted where they'd be, and fired preemptively." "Yes, sir." "Battalion command explicitly told you not to do this." "Yes, sir." "Lieutenant Harrison says you insisted." "Against orders." Frank said nothing. There wasn't much to say. Summerall looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. And immediate promotion to sergeant. We're going to need you training every artillery forward observer in this army." Frank blinked. "Sir? The war might be ending, corporal, sergeant, but what you figured out, predicting enemy movement based on timing patterns, that's going to change artillery doctrine. We're going to study this. We're going to teach it." He tapped the logbook. "This is the future of counter-battery fire." In the months after the Meuse Argonne, as the war ground toward its November 1918 conclusion, artillery officers across the AEF quietly began teaching predictive counter-battery fire. They called it the Mosher method in some circles, though officially it was designated pattern recognition counter-battery doctrine. The technique was taught at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill after the war. Instructors would present the Meuse Argonne case study, often without naming Frank Mosher, as an example of innovative tactical thinking. The core principle that enemy behavior follows predictable patterns that can be timed and exploited influenced artillery training for decades. By World War II, American artillery forward observers routinely tracked enemy firing patterns, calculated displacement schedules, and delivered preemptive fire on predicted positions. The British and French artillery schools studied the method. The Germans, examining captured American artillery manuals after the war, incorporated similar timing analysis into their own doctrine. What had seemed stupid to that French liaison officer, firing at where the enemy would be rather than where they were, became standard practice. After the armistice, Frank Mosher returned to Osceola, Iowa. He married Ruth Henderson in June 1919 and went back to work for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, this time as a dispatcher. It was a job that required timing, precision, coordinating train movements, preventing collisions, managing schedules across hundreds of miles of track. Frank was very good at it. He never spoke much about the war. When asked, he'd shrug and say he'd done his job. The Distinguished Service Cross sat in a drawer in his dresser. His wife found it once while putting away laundry and asked about it. "For artillery work," he said. "Nothing special." He passed away in 1953 at age 58, heart failure related to mustard gas exposure during the Argonne fighting. His obituary in the Osceola Sentinel ran 4 lines, noting his railroad career and his service in France. It didn't mention the 40 German guns or the hundreds of American lives saved. There's a small memorial in the Clark County Courthouse listing World War I veterans from Osceola. Frank Mosher's name appears alphabetically, no different from the others. Most people walk past without noticing. But at Fort Sill, in the Field Artillery Museum, there's a display on counter-battery fire evolution. One section discusses predictive timing methods developed during World War I. A footnote mentions innovative techniques employed during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The techniques that began with a railroad dispatcher's son timing enemy artillery batteries with a stopwatch and a notebook. There's a temptation to call stories like this improbable. It's easy to think that battles are decided by superior firepower, better equipment, more troops. We like to believe that war is won through conventional means, following doctrine, doing what the manuals say. But the truth is that wars are often decided by ordinary men who notice patterns others miss, by soldiers who trust mathematics over convention, by corporals who understand that timing, whether in railroad operations or artillery barrages, can mean the difference between dead and alive. Frank Mosher didn't win the war, but he saved an attack that might have failed. He destroyed 40 enemy guns that would have killed hundreds of American soldiers. And he proved that sometimes the stupid idea, firing at where the enemy will be rather than where they are, is actually the smart one. The artillery manuals changed because one man with a stopwatch and a railroad dispatcher's understanding of timing patterns refused to accept that doctrine was unchangeable. Because he understood that the enemy, like freight trains, follows schedules. And if you know the schedule, you can predict where they'll be. And if you can predict where they'll be, you can be waiting for them. In a war that killed millions through rigid adherence to failed doctrines, Frank Mosher succeeded by doing exactly what his superiors told him not to do. He thought about timing, just like his father taught him. Just like he'd learned on the railroad, and just like the shells he calculated would arrive at exactly 4:52 a.m., his innovation hit its mark precisely when it needed to. Sometimes the difference between slaughter and victory is measured in seconds. Frank Mosher knew how to count them. What would you have done in Mosher's position? Would you have trusted your calculations enough to fire on coordinates where no enemy activity had been observed? Would you have defied explicit orders from battalion command because you believed your timing pattern analysis was correct? Which moment in this story stayed with you? The 43 minutes of precisely timed barrages, the quiet return to railroad dispatching, or the recognition that timing patterns could change artillery doctrine? Let us know in the comments below. If you believe we should remember the quiet innovations that saved lives during the Great War, the mathematical insights that mattered as much as courage, share this with someone who appreciates how wars are won, not just through firepower, but through thinking differently. Because sometimes the mud and thunder of World War I couldn't bury a simple truth, that patterns exist everywhere, even in war. And sometimes one man with a stopwatch can see what entire armies miss,